The development of the Eastern Shore is really rather interesting. There was no bayway until the 1920s, the late 1920s. So the only access to the Eastern Shore was by boat, steamer. And the steamers went out of Mobile. And Mobile also had GM&O Railroad, which was the Gulf, Mobile, and Ohio Railroad. So after the Civil War, GM&O really developed the whole railroad network, and Mobile was a hub with a terminal over there. And then the bay boats, which were right next to the terminal, would come to the Eastern Shore. And there were boat docks in Daphne and Battles Wharf, and then the Grand Hotel, for example. There was also Zundel's landing in other places. But there was no landing in Fairhope because there was no Fairhope. Fairhope was just settled by people. A lot of them were African Americans. There was a tremendous number of landowners on the Eastern Shore that were African American, white and African American. And some of them lived in the Fairhope area, but they didn't call it Fairhope area. There was Tatumville and several other names of several of the sort of small communities that were there. In 1879, a gentleman by the name of Henry George, a brilliant human being, wrote a book called Progress and Poverty. And it talked about how can there be so much progress and yet so much poverty at the same time. And he said it came down to land ownership. To this day in England, the royal family and the crown owns somewhere in the neighborhood of 70% of the land in England. And you have a lease in England that is about a 100-year lease when you lease something. But the problem with those leases is they run down year by year, and you can't renew them. So when you get closer to the end of your lease, your property taxes are going to jump. So you can't get as much money for your improvements on your property. So all of that boils down. Henry George said that's unfair because you're a prisoner of wealthy people who own large blocks of land. So he said what you do is you lease land to people, and then you allow them to build and not be punished economically for the improvements they build. What you're hoping is the aggregate amount of improvements that people build will drive up the value of the improvements, but you hold the land cost down because you're not trying to profit from the land cost. But this really caught on, but to change it nationally or internationally was going to be a movement that was going to be very difficult. So the Des Moines, Iowa Single Tax Club, headed by a gentleman by the name of E.B. Gaston, decided that they were going to form their own utopian community. So they sent out teams of people. They met in January of 1894 in Des Moines, and they had worked up a constitution. And the constitution was approved unanimously by all the single taxers that were there. Then they approved creating a town or charter, and that was approved. And then somebody in the back said, well, where is this town? They said, well, we haven't chosen it yet, but we'll be looking for the sites. And that's when a gentleman by the name of Alf Wooster spoke up and said, I think this has a fair hope of success. And they said, that's catchy, let's call the town Fairhope. So they started to send out teams of people. They were largely looking in the South because the South was still ravaged by the Civil War, and economically land was inexpensive. And what they wanted to do was find a large block of land that they could buy inexpensively and then develop the value on it using the single tax system. So George Belanger and Mr. Mann came to this area and wrote back saying, we found the perfect spot to build Fairhope. There's a spring, and there's still a spring. And they said, we have water, we have high bluffs and sandy banks, the land seems to be good, so I think this is where we should build our utopia. So they hands down approved the site and decided to have what's called the Roundup on November 15th, 1895. You couldn't get to Fairhope. There was no pier in Fairhope. So they had to arrive in Battles Wharf by steamer then, and some of the people had come down from Ohio and other places in the north in Conestoga wagons to be here. And they rounded up here on November 15th, 1895, and started their experiment, which they called Fairhope. And it's been, I would say, an overwhelming success. Now, what the Fairhopians did from the beginning is they gave women equal rights from the get-go, voting rights and organizational status within the single tax corporation. They also, E.B. very much was troubled. He wanted to give African Americans equal rights in the single tax, but he couldn't do it because they would have been burned out. The rednecks are always with us, and there are a lot of people that felt very, very strongly about that. And so when they came to Nancy Lewis, E.B. paid her far more than her house was worth and property was worth to buy it from her. And with that, she was able to buy, I think, 30 acres and be able to build another house on there. And so that's why Fairhope sort of formed the way it did. As of today, we have over 4,500 acres of land. We have 3,500 lessees, and we are a thriving community.